April 18, 1972. Gulf of Tonkin, North Vietnam. The sky was a vast, unforgiving canvas of blue as Captain Lawrence Forrest hunched forward in the cramped rear seat of the Marine F-4 Phantom. Sweat trickled down his neck despite the cockpit's air conditioning, his eyes darting between the radar screen and the hastily marked paper map spread across his knees. The headset crackled with urgent warnings from other aircraft as 12 MiG-17 fighters approached from the northwest, far more than intelligence had predicted. "Bandits! Multiple bandits! Vector 270!" came the tense voice of Lieutenant Commander Richards in the lead F-4. "Count is 12 plus. Repeat, 1-2 tangos inbound." In the front seat, Major Thomas Wilson swore under his breath, "Control says withdraw immediately. We're outnumbered." Forrest stared at his map, the pencil lines he'd drawn before takeoff suddenly making a different kind of sense. The standard withdrawal route would funnel them directly into the MiGs' optimal attack corridor. The North Vietnamese had predicted their escape path. "Sir," Forrest's voice was steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Request permission for Mapline call." "Negative, Captain. Follow standard withdrawal procedures." Forrest's fingers tightened around his pencil. The Mapline call, his unofficial designation for a radical tactical maneuver he'd developed but never tested in combat, violated 3 standing operational protocols. Using it meant career suicide at best, court-martial at worst. Through the canopy he could see the distant glints of sunlight on metal as the MiGs closed in. 8 American aircraft against 12 enemy fighters. The math was simple and brutal. "Sir," he tried again, "standard withdrawal is a trap. They're counting on it." A moment of radio silence followed, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the radar warning. Forrest made his decision. His fingers flew across the radio dial, switching to the squadron frequency. "All units, this is Phantom 2-6. Execute Mapline Delta. I repeat, execute Mapline Delta. Acknowledge." One by one, confused acknowledgements came back. Major Wilson turned in his seat, expression unreadable behind his oxygen mask. But he didn't countermand the order. As the squadron banked sharply into a formation no one had authorized, but everyone was somehow following, no one in the United States Marine Corps knew that one black officer's defiance that morning would rewrite the tactical doctrine of an entire air wing and save the lives of 32 American airmen in the process. Lawrence Forrest was born on March 7, 1945, in the small town of Meridian, Mississippi. The son of a World War II veteran who had served in the segregated 92nd Infantry Division, the famed Buffalo Soldiers, young Lawrence grew up hearing stories of duty, sacrifice, and the complicated patriotism of black Americans fighting for a country that didn't always fight for them. His father, Samuel Forrest, had returned from Europe with a Bronze Star and a determination to provide his children with opportunities he'd never had. "The military showed me the world," he often told Lawrence, "but I had to fight twice as hard to be seen as half as good." The Forrest home was modest but disciplined. Lawrence's mother, Eleanor, a schoolteacher, instilled in him a reverence for education and precision. By age 10, Lawrence could recite multiplication tables to 20, name all the state capitals, and explain the basics of aerodynamics, a fascination that began when his father took him to an air show at the nearby Meridian Naval Air Station in 1955. "I remember watching those Corsairs screaming overhead," Forrest would later recall in an oral history interview, "and thinking there couldn't be anything more powerful than controlling something that fast, that free." High school presented challenges beyond academics. As one of only 12 black students in a newly integrated school system, Lawrence faced daily reminders of the civil rights struggles transforming America. He excelled in mathematics and physics, but was passed over for advanced placement classes until a perceptive science teacher, Mr. Harold Winthrop, recognized his talent and became his advocate. "Lawrence doesn't just solve problems," Winthrop wrote in a college recommendation letter. "He sees patterns that others miss. He thinks three-dimensionally when others are stuck in flatland." This spatial intelligence would later become Forrest's signature skill as a radar intercept officer, RIO. But the path from Meridian to the backseat of a Phantom jet was far from direct. Despite graduating third in his class in 1963, Lawrence's applications to engineering programs received tepid responses. His father suggested a military route to college. "The Marines will pay for your education," Samuel advised, "and they'll judge you more by what you can do than by what you look like." This assessment proved optimistic, but not entirely wrong. Lawrence enlisted in the Marine Corps in August 1963, scoring in the 98th percentile on aptitude tests. His scores earned him placement in the Naval Aviation Cadet Program after basic training, though not without resistance. "There was this captain at Officer Candidate School," Forrest later recalled, "who pulled me aside and said, 'The only reason you're here is because Washington needs its numbers. Don't expect to fly.'" He paused before adding, "That man did me a favor. Every time training got tough, I'd think of his face and find another gear." Lawrence graduated from Officer Candidate School in April 1964, one of only 3 black candidates in his class of 97. His exemplary performance in navigation and systems management led to his assignment as a radar intercept officer rather than a pilot, a position that suited his analytical mind, but that many perceived as less prestigious. "People thought RAOs were just along for the ride," said retired Colonel James Hardin, who served with Forrest. Nothing could be further from the truth. In the F-4, the RAO was handling radar, navigation, communications, electronic countermeasures, and weapon systems while the pilot concentrated on flying. It was like being the brains of the operation while the pilot was the hands. At Naval Flight Officer School in Pensacola, Florida, Forrest distinguished himself through an unusual approach to navigation problems. While other trainees relied primarily on electronic systems, he developed a hybrid method that combined traditional map reading with radar interpretation, creating redundant systems that would prove invaluable in combat. "Forrest could tell you where we were within a quarter mile just by glancing at a map and the coastline," recalled Lieutenant Peter Scanlon, a pilot who trained with him. The instructors started calling it the Forrest Fix when he'd correct their deliberate navigation errors in training flights. This aptitude earned him assignment to Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 333, VMFA 333, known as the Shamrocks, in 1968. Deployed to Da Nang Air Base in Vietnam in early 1969, Forrest quickly accumulated combat experience, flying 76 missions in his first tour. Yet despite his growing reputation for tactical excellence, Forrest encountered the familiar barriers of the era. Passed over twice for the squadron's tactical officer position, despite recommendations from his commanders, he channeled his frustration into developing alternative combat approaches that would later form the foundation of his Mapline system. "Lawrence never complained," said Master Sergeant Raymond Wilson, a ground crew chief at Da Nang. "He just worked harder. After missions, while other officers were unwinding, he'd be in the operations room studying engagement reports, plotting positions, looking for patterns everyone else missed." By the time he returned for his second tour in January 1972, Captain Lawrence Forrest had logged over 800 flight hours and developed a comprehensive alternative to standard fighter tactics, a system he called three-dimensional displacement maneuvering, but which the pilots simply called Forrest's Maps. He had no idea that soon those carefully plotted lines and calculated probabilities would be all that stood between his squadron and annihilation. The air war over North Vietnam in 1972 had entered a new and deadly phase. After the relative quiet of the previous 3 years, a period when American bombing of the North had been curtailed under President Nixon's Vietnamization policy, the North Vietnamese Army launched the Easter Offensive on March 30th, 1972. This massive conventional invasion pushed across the demilitarized zone with unprecedented force, sending 120,000 troops and 200 tanks southward in the largest military operation of the war. The American response was swift and overwhelming. Operation Linebacker, authorized on May 8th, would eventually deliver over 100,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam. But in April, as the Easter Offensive gained momentum, air operations were still ramping up in a dangerous transitional period. American air power was being hastily redirected from South Vietnamese support missions to counter North Vietnamese advances and supply lines. For Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 333, stationed at Da Nang Air Base, this meant a dramatic shift in operations. Previously focused on close air support missions for ground troops, The Shamrocks were now flying deeper into North Vietnam, engaging more frequently with enemy MiG fighters and facing increasingly sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses. "We were trained for one mission and suddenly doing another," explained Colonel Harold Matthews, the squadron commander at the time. "Our pilots were excellent at supporting troops on the ground, but intercepting MiGs at high altitude over enemy territory was a different game entirely." The North Vietnamese Air Force had also evolved significantly. By 1972, they operated approximately 200 combat aircraft, including MiG-17, MiG-19 and MiG-21 fighters. While fewer in number than American aircraft, these Soviet-built fighters were formidable opponents, especially in the hands of North Vietnamese pilots who had developed specialized tactics to maximize their advantages. The MiG-17, though older and slower than the American F-4 Phantom, was exceptionally maneuverable. North Vietnamese pilots used this agility to lure American aircraft into turning dogfights, where the heavier Phantoms lost energy quickly. The MiG-21, conversely, excelled in hit-and-run attacks, using its superior acceleration to strike and then withdraw before American aircraft could respond effectively. "They had gotten very good at predicting our movements," noted Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sinclair, an intelligence officer with the 7th Air Force. "By analyzing our tactics over years of combat, they'd identified patterns in how we approached targets, which routes we took home, even how we responded to being ambushed. This predictability was becoming increasingly deadly. In the first 2 weeks of April 1972 alone, 13 American aircraft were lost to MiG interceptors, a dramatic increase from previous months. 7 of these losses occurred during withdrawal from bombing runs when American aircraft were low on fuel and ammunition. The standard American response, flying in tight formations with designated lookout sectors for each aircraft, provided some protection but required strict adherence to predetermined routes and procedures. This rigidity was something Captain Lawrence Forrest had identified as a critical weakness. "Our tactics weren't adapting as quickly as theirs were," Forrest wrote in a tactical analysis he submitted to Squadron Command in February. "We're fighting the last war while they're fighting this one." His report, which included detailed maps showing how North Vietnamese interceptors were positioned to exploit American withdrawal corridors, received little attention. The prevailing view among senior officers was that standardized procedures ensured predictability among American units, a necessity for coordination in complex air operations. What Forrest proposed instead was a system of alternate routes and formations that could be called up with minimal communication, allowing squadrons to shift patterns rapidly in response to enemy movements. He called it the Mapline system, with each potential formation and route designated by a color and number code. "It's like having 20 different plays in a playbook instead of just 2 or 3, he explained to his roommate, Captain Daniel Roberts. "We plot them all out beforehand, practice them until they're second nature, then call the right one based on what the defense is showing us." Roberts, impressed by the concept but skeptical of its reception, advised caution. "The brass likes predictability, Larry. Your system means every squadron would need to learn a whole new way of operating." Forrest had nodded, understanding the institutional resistance he faced. "Maybe, but predictability is getting our guys killed." By mid-April, as the Easter offensive intensified, Marine air operations expanded to include strikes against North Vietnamese supply lines feeding the invasion. These missions took American aircraft deeper into the Gulf of Tonkin, approaching the vital port city of Haiphong, where Soviet ships delivered supplies to North Vietnamese forces. The mission on April 18th, codenamed Operation Thunderhead, targeted coastal radar installations that were directing MiG interceptors against American bombing runs. VMFA 333 would provide fighter escort for a flight of A-6 intruders tasked with destroying these radar sites. Intelligence briefings that morning indicated possible MiG activity, but predicted no more than 4 interceptors would respond. As Captain Forrest strapped into the rear seat of Phantom call sign Devil 26, he carried with him the unauthorized set of Mapline charts he had developed, a decision that would soon prove fateful. The North Vietnamese had been waiting. They had analyzed the patterns of previous strikes against coastal targets and positioned a full squadron of MiG-17 fighters at optimal interception coordinates. As the American formation completed their bombing run and began their standard withdrawal, the trap was sprung. The next 30 minutes would test everything Lawrence Forrest had trained for, everything he believed about tactical flexibility, and everything he had risked in preparing for a moment he hoped would never come. "MiGs, 3 o'clock high!" The warning crackled through Captain Lawrence Forrest's headset as he instinctively scanned the airspace to the right of their formation. The April sun glinted off distant metal, the unmistakable silhouette of Soviet-built MiG-17 fighters descending from 20,000 feet. Major Wilson tensed in the front seat of their F-4 Phantom. "I count 4. No, 6 bandits." Forrest's eyes narrowed as he processed the tactical picture. "More coming in from the north, sir. Radar shows. 12 contacts, 12 MiGs total." The squadron radio erupted with chatter as other aircraft confirmed the sightings. 8 American F-4s against 12 North Vietnamese MiGs, odds that translated to mortal danger in the unforgiving mathematics of air combat. "All units, this is Shamrock Lead," came the voice of Lieutenant Commander Richards. "Execute standard defensive withdrawal. Form up on me heading 180. Forrest felt his stomach tighten. The standard withdrawal would take them southward, over the exact corridor he had identified in his tactical analysis, a path the North Vietnamese had clearly anticipated. His hand moved to the map case strapped to his thigh, withdrawing the folded chart he'd prepared with alternative routes and formations. "Major," he said, keeping his voice level despite the adrenaline surging through his system, "requesting permission to suggest alternative withdrawal route. Standard path takes us directly through their optimal engagement zone." Wilson's reply was tense. "Negative, Captain. We follow squadron lead." Through the canopy, Forrest could see the formation beginning to tighten as the 8 Phantoms moved into the defensive withdrawal pattern, a pattern they had flown dozens of times before, a pattern the North Vietnamese could predict down to the altitude and airspeed. The first missile launch came seconds later, an atoll air-to-air missile streaking from beneath the wing of a distant MiG. "Missile in the air! Break right, break right!" The frantic call came from Devil 1-4 as the American formation fractured, aircraft banking sharply to deploy chaff and flares. The missile detonated harmlessly between 2 Phantoms, but its purpose had been achieved. The American formation was now compromised. Individual aircraft momentarily separated and vulnerable. Forrest watched as 3 MiGs descended on an isolated F-4, forcing it lower where 4 more enemy fighters waited. The trap was perfectly executed, funneling American aircraft exactly where the North Vietnamese wanted them. In that moment, Captain Lawrence Forrest understood they had to act beyond orders. Standard tactics weren't just failing, they were complicit in the ambush. "Sir," he said with quiet intensity, "we need to execute Mapline Delta immediately. They've anticipated our withdrawal route. This is exactly the scenario I mapped out." Major Wilson hesitated, torn between protocol and the rapidly deteriorating tactical situation. "That's not an authorized maneuver, Captain." "With respect, sir, look at what's happening to Devil 1-4 and 1-3. Forrest pointed to where the 2 Phantoms were now desperately jinking to avoid missiles, being driven further from the formation with each evasive maneuver. Wilson was silent for 3 excruciating seconds, watching as another missile streaked toward their comrades. "Explain it fast," he finally said. Forrest's words came in a practiced rush. "Mapline Delta splits our formation into 3 elements, each taking separate egress routes at different altitudes. We reconverge 20 miles south-southeast. It confuses their intercept vectors and prevents them from concentrating forces." Another missile launch, another desperate radio call from a squadron mate. Wilson made his decision. "Do it." Forrest switched to the squadron frequency. "All units, this is Devil 2-6. Execute Mapline Delta. I repeat, execute Mapline Delta." The confusion was immediate and understandable. "What the hell is Mapline Delta?" came the strained voice of one pilot. "Break into 3 elements by wingman pairs," Forrest directed, his voice calm and precise despite the chaos. "Element 1, descend to Angels 8 and proceed heading 140. Element 2, maintain Angels 15 and proceed heading 190. Element 3, climb to Angels 22 and proceed heading 220. All elements reconverge at Point Sierra Echo in 4 minutes. There was a moment of stunned silence on the radio. Lieutenant Commander Richards, the squadron leader, broke in. "This is Shamrock Lead. Whose authorization?" "Sir, this is Devil 2-6, Forrest cut in, knowing he was committing a serious breach of protocol by interrupting a superior officer. "MiGs have predicted our standard withdrawal. This alternative has been pre-plotted. Request immediate execution before we lose aircraft." The desperation in the cockpit of Devil 1-4 made the decision. "I've got 4 bandits on my tail. I can't shake them." Richards made his call. "All units execute as Devil 2-6 instructs now." The American formation fractured into 3 pairs, each banking sharply onto divergent headings. The suddenness of the maneuver momentarily confused the North Vietnamese pilots, who had expected the Americans to maintain their standard withdrawal formation. In the front seat, Major Wilson executed a sharp diving turn, pushing the Phantom down 5,000 feet in seconds while accelerating to over 600 knots. The G-forces pressed Forrest back into his seat as he monitored the radar, watching the confused pattern of MiG responses. "Element 2 has 3 MiGs in pursuit," came a report from Devil 1-1. "But they're overshooting. Can't match our heading change." "Element 3 has climbed above the MiG's ceiling," reported Devil 3-2. "No pursuit possible at this altitude." Forrest studied his radar screen intently, counting contacts. "We've split their formation. 4 MiGs following Element 1, 3 on Element 2, none able to pursue Element 3. That leaves 5 unaccounted for." "They're holding station at the original ambush point," Wilson observed, banking the Phantom through a layer of clouds, "waiting for us to return to the standard route." For the next 3 minutes, the 3 American elements flew their separate paths through the skies over the Gulf of Tonkin. The North Vietnamese pilots, trained to operate in coordinated groups, found themselves unable to effectively pursue all 3 elements simultaneously. The MiGs that followed Elements 1 and 2 quickly found themselves at a disadvantage, pursuing American aircraft that had already anticipated their intercept vectors. "2 MiGs breaking off from Element 2 pursuit," came the report from Devil 1-1. "They can't maintain the pace." As the Americans approached the predetermined convergence point, carefully selected by Forrest to be just beyond the effective combat radius of the MiG-17, the tactical picture had transformed. From a deadly ambush with overwhelming odds, the situation had evolved into a disorganized pursuit where American technical advantages could reassert themselves. "All elements, this is Devil 2-6, Forrest called. "Execute second phase of Mapline Delta. Element 3, reverse course to heading 040 and descend to Angels 18. Prepare to engage pursuing MiGs from Elements 1 and 2. This was the masterstroke of Forrest's tactical innovation. Rather than simply escaping the ambush, Mapline Delta had reconfigured the battlefield. Element 3, having avoided pursuit entirely by climbing above the MiG's operational ceiling, was now positioned to drop down behind the North Vietnamese aircraft that were still chasing Elements 1 and 2. "Copy that," came the response from Devil 3-1, the lead aircraft in Element 3. "Executing now." Forrest watched his radar as Element 3 descended rapidly, positioning themselves perfectly behind the pursuing MiGs. The North Vietnamese pilots, focused entirely on catching their prey, failed to detect the threat now developing behind them. "Element 3 has radar lock on 2 bandits," reported Devil 3-1, Fox 1. 2 Sparrow radar-guided missiles streaked from Element 3's Phantoms, catching the pursuing MiGs completely by surprise. One missile struck directly, sending a MiG-17 tumbling toward the sea in flames. The second missed but forced the targeted MiG to break off its pursuit, dumping altitude in a desperate evasive maneuver. "Splash 1 MiG!" called Devil 3-1, the exhilaration evident in his voice. The tables had turned completely. What had begun as a perfect ambush by North Vietnamese forces had devolved into confusion and retreat. The remaining MiGs, their coordinated attack now shattered, began to withdraw northward. "All Shamrock units, form up at Convergence Point Sierra Echo," Forrest directed. "Standard defensive formation for final withdrawal." As the American Phantoms regrouped, the pilots' voices on the radio reflected their astonishment at what had just transpired. "What the hell was that maneuver, 2-6?" asked one pilot, his voice a mixture of confusion and admiration. "Just something I've been working on," Forrest replied calmly, though his heart was still pounding. "Alternative withdrawal routes based on analysis of MiG intercept patterns." Lieutenant Commander Richards' voice cut in. "Whatever it was, it worked. All aircraft report status." One by one, the Phantoms checked in. Incredibly, all 8 had survived the engagement with only minor damage to 2 aircraft. The squadron had not only escaped a deadly trap, but had managed to down 1 MiG and damage another without suffering any losses. As they formed up for the final leg home to Da Nang, Major Wilson turned slightly in his seat. "That was either the most brilliant or the most foolhardy thing I've ever seen, Captain. Probably both." Forrest allowed himself a small smile behind his oxygen mask. "Sometimes the rule book and survival are mutually exclusive, sir. What no one in the cockpit of Devil 2-6 could have predicted was that this unauthorized tactical innovation, born of necessity and executed in defiance of standard operating procedures, would soon be studied in detail at the highest levels of naval aviation. The mathematical precision of the Mapline system, combined with its demonstrated effectiveness against superior numbers, would eventually transform air combat doctrine throughout the US military. But in that moment, flying south over the Gulf of Tonkin, Captain Lawrence Forrest was simply relieved that 32 American airmen were returning home alive, an outcome that the cold equations of air combat had initially deemed improbable at best. The aftermath of the April 18th engagement unfolded in ways that none of the participants could have predicted. When VMFA 333 landed at Da Nang Air Base, the 8 Phantoms taxied to their hardstands amid the usual post-mission routines. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, checking for damage and preparing for debriefing. But there was an unmistakable electricity in the air, the kind that emerges when men have faced death together and emerged victorious against impossible odds. Captain Forrest climbed down from the rear cockpit of Devil 2-6, legs slightly unsteady from the lingering effects of adrenaline. As he removed his helmet, he found himself surrounded by pilots and RIOs from the squadron, their faces animated with questions. "What the hell was that maneuver, Forrest?" asked Captain James Donahue, the RIO from Devil 11. "Mapline Delta? Where did that come from?" Before Forrest could answer, Major Wilson intervened. "Debrief room, 15 minutes. All flight crews, no exceptions." The debriefing that followed was unlike any in the squadron's history. Standard procedure called for a methodical review of the mission, analyzing each phase chronologically. Instead, Lieutenant Commander Richards began with a single question directed at Captain Forrest. "Captain, explain Mapline Delta in detail." For the next 45 minutes, Forrest outlined the tactical system he had developed over the previous 18 months, a comprehensive alternative to standard fighter tactics based on probability matrices and three-dimensional displacement. Using a chalkboard, he explained how he had analyzed hundreds of combat reports, identifying patterns in North Vietnamese interception techniques and developing counters to each. "The fundamental problem with our standard procedures," he explained, drawing a diagram on the board, "is predictability. By maintaining consistent withdrawal routes and formations, we're giving the enemy fixed reference points for interception." He described how the Mapline system used pre-planned alternative formations and routes, each designated by a color number code that could be quickly communicated in combat. The system included not just evasive patterns, but offensive counters that turned retreats into ambushes, exactly as they had done that day. As he concluded his explanation, the room fell silent. Then Major Wilson spoke. "I authorized the execution of Captain Forrest's maneuver today because I believed it was our only viable option. The results speak for themselves. 8 aircraft engaged against 12 MiGs, all our aircraft returned, 1 confirmed enemy kill." Lieutenant Commander Richards nodded slowly. "Captain Forrest, I need complete documentation of this system. Every chart, every calculation, every scenario, on my desk by 0800 tomorrow." "Yes, sir," Forrest replied, uncertain whether he was being commended or preparing for disciplinary action. Richards continued, "I'll be frank. What you did today violated multiple standing orders regarding engagement protocols. Under normal circumstances, that would warrant serious consequences." He paused. looking around the room at the faces of his pilots and RIOs. "But these aren't normal circumstances. You saved this squadron today." The official report filed by Richards that evening was carefully worded. It documented the encounter with North Vietnamese forces and the successful withdrawal of all aircraft, but described the maneuver simply as an alternative tactical formation executed at the discretion of the squadron commander. There was no mention of Captain Forrest's role in developing or initiating the tactic. 3 days later, however, Forrest was summoned to the office of Colonel Walter Bryce, commander of Marine Aircraft Group 11. He entered expecting reprimand, perhaps even charges. Instead, he found Bryce studying the Mapline documentation with intense interest. Spread across his desk were Forrest's meticulously drawn charts, probability matrices, and tactical analyses. "Sit down, Captain," Bryce said without looking up. "This is remarkable work." "Thank you, sir." Bryce finally raised his eyes from the documents. "You realize you've violated about a dozen protocols, developing unauthorized tactics, implementing them without proper clearance, countermanding established procedures in combat." Forrest maintained military bearing. "Yes, sir." "You also saved 8 aircraft and 16 men." Bryce leaned back in his chair. "Tell me something, Forrest. Why didn't you submit this through proper channels?" The question hung in the air. Both men knew the answer, but Bryce wanted to hear it directly. "I did, sir, 3 times over the past year. My reports were acknowledged, but no action was taken." Bryce nodded, unsurprised. "Because you're a RIO, not a pilot. Because tactical development is supposed to come from above, not below. And because—" He paused, weighing his words carefully. "Because the military doesn't always recognize talent when it wears an unexpected face." The implication was clear. As one of the few black officers in a position of tactical responsibility, Forrest had faced barriers beyond mere rank and position. "What happens now, sir?" Forrest asked. "Now? Now I have a decision to make." Bryce gathered the Mapline documents into a folder. The by-the-book response would be to reprimand you, possibly even court-martial for insubordination. The practical response is to recognize that your system just accomplished what our standard tactics couldn't. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the airfield. "I'm sending your work to Com 7th FLT with my personal recommendation for implementation across all fighter squadrons in theater. I'm also recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross." Forrest was stunned. "Sir, "Don't thank me yet, Captain," Bryce interrupted. "There will be resistance. There always is to new ideas, especially when they come from unexpected sources. But what matters is that your system works. And in this business, results trump everything else." Within 2 weeks, the first elements of the Mapline system were being incorporated into standard operating procedures for Marine fighter squadrons throughout Vietnam. By June, a tactical bulletin titled "Adaptive Formation Maneuvering in Hostile Airspace" was distributed to all Navy and Marine Corps air units in Southeast Asia. Though the document never mentioned Forrest by name, pilots quickly began referring to the new tactics as Forrest's Maplines. For Captain Lawrence Forrest himself, the aftermath brought mixed consequences. The promised Distinguished Flying Cross was downgraded to an Air Medal, with the citation carefully worded to emphasize his support role, rather than his tactical innovation. He received no formal promotion or recognition for developing the system that was now saving American lives on a weekly basis. Yet among the pilots and RIOs who flew combat missions, Forrest's reputation soared. When he entered the officers' club, conversations would pause momentarily as pilots nodded in acknowledgement. More significantly, junior officers, including several who had previously kept their distance from the black officer, began seeking his advice on tactical problems. "The guys who matter know what you did," Major Wilson told him one evening. "And in this war, that counts for more than any medal they could pin on you." By the time Lawrence Forrest completed his tour and returned to the United States in October 1972, elements of his tactical system had been incorporated into training programs at the Navy Fighter Weapons School, the elite program that would later become known as Top Gun. Though the instructors there referred to these concepts as dynamic displacement tactics rather than Mapline, the principles remained unmistakably Forrest's. After Vietnam, Captain Forrest's military career followed a path that reflected both the opportunities and limitations of his era. Promoted to Major in 1974, he served as a tactics instructor at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point before being assigned to the Pentagon in 1977. There, working in relative obscurity within the Office of Naval Research, he continued refining and expanding his tactical innovations. He retired from the Marines as a lieutenant colonel in 1985, having served 22 years. His retirement ceremony was modest, attended primarily by fellow officers who had flown with him in Vietnam. No general officers were present, and the official citation made only passing reference to his contributions to tactical development. After the military, Forrest worked as a defense contractor, developing simulation systems for fighter training. He married Sarah Jenkins, a mathematics professor he met while taking graduate courses at George Washington University. They raised 2 children in Alexandria, Virginia, both of whom would later serve in the military, his daughter as a Navy pilot. Throughout his civilian life, Forrest rarely spoke about the events over the Gulf of Tonkin in April 1972. When pressed by colleagues or asked during the occasional interview for military history publications, he would typically downplay his role. It was a squadron effort, he would insist. Everyone executed perfectly once the plan was in motion. But the pilots who had been there remembered differently. On the 20th anniversary of the engagement, 7 of the original 16 airmen gathered at the home of retired Colonel Thomas Wilson, the pilot who had been in the front seat of Devil 26 that day. "I've never told this story publicly," Wilson said as they sat on his deck overlooking Chesapeake Bay, "but it needs to be said. Lawrence Forrest saved all our lives that day, and he did it by breaking every rule in the book." Captain Peter Scanlon, who had flown as Element 3 lead, nodded in agreement. The brass never wanted to admit that a black RIO from Mississippi outsmarted not just the North Vietnamese, but our own tactical doctrine, but those of us who were there know the truth. The most poignant recognition came in 1994, when the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola installed an exhibit on tactical innovations from the Vietnam War. Among the displays was a small section titled Adaptive Tactics, the Evolution of Air Combat Doctrine, 1972-1975. It featured a reproduction of one of Forrest's original Mapline charts, alongside a brief description of how alternative tactical approaches developed by junior officers often influenced formal doctrine. Though Forrest's name appeared nowhere in the exhibit text, when he visited the museum with his grandchildren in 2003, an elderly docent, himself a Vietnam veteran, recognized him immediately. "You're him, aren't you?" the man asked quietly. "The Mapline officer, the one who turned the MiGs back." Forrest simply smiled and moved on, his grandchildren unaware of the exchange. He never called himself a hero. In his final interview given to the Oral History Project at the Naval Institute in 2008, Forrest was asked whether he felt his contributions had been properly recognized. "Recognition wasn't the point," he replied after careful consideration. "The point was effectiveness. The point was bringing our people home." He paused, then added, "In war, innovation often comes from necessity. We found ourselves in a situation where following the rules meant accepting defeat. I couldn't accept that. Not when I knew there was another way." Lawrence Forrest passed away on October 12, 2011, at the age of 66. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by over 300 people, far more than his family had expected. Among them were 11 pilots and radar intercept officers who had served in Vietnam, including all the surviving members of the April 18th mission. They came not because Forrest had been decorated with the highest medals or achieved the highest rank, but because his actions had given them something beyond price, the chance to live full lives. In 2017, a researcher at the Naval History and Heritage Command discovered a cache of documents while digitizing records from the Vietnam era. Among them was a handwritten letter from Admiral Thomas Moore, who had served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 1970 to 1974. The letter, addressed to the Secretary of the Navy but apparently never sent, recommended Captain Lawrence Forrest for the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor, for his actions on April 18, 1972. While Captain Forrest's tactical innovation violated established protocols, Moorer wrote, it demonstrated the highest traditions of American military service, initiative, courage, and tactical brilliance under fire. More importantly, it saved the lives of 16 naval aviators who would likely have been lost had standard procedures been followed. I believe this warrants formal recognition at the highest level. The letter was dated July 9, 1972, and included a detailed analysis of the engagement that credited Forrest's Mapline system with creating a paradigm shift in fighter tactics. For reasons never fully explained, the recommendation was never forwarded up the chain of command. When this document came to light, the naval aviation community responded with a grassroots campaign to recognize Forrest's contribution posthumously. In 2019, a memorial plaque was installed at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, acknowledging that the tactical system, known variously as dynamic displacement maneuvering and adaptive formation tactics, had originated with Captain Lawrence Forrest's Mapline system. The plaque includes a quote from one of the pilots who flew that day. Sometimes the most courageous act in combat is not charging into fire, but having the moral courage to defy convention when lives are at stake. Perhaps the most telling testament to Forrest's legacy came not from official recognition, but from the pilots who followed him. By the 1980s, elements of the Mapline system had been incorporated into standard fighter tactics throughout the U.S. military, with new generations of pilots learning principles that had once been considered radical. Few of these young aviators knew the origin of these tactics or the name of the Black Marine Corps RIO who had developed them in the backseat of an F-4 Phantom. But in ready rooms and squadron bars, the story persisted, passed along by those who knew, embellished by those who didn't, but always preserving its essential truth. That on April 18, 1972, over the Gulf of Tonkin, a junior officer named Lawrence Forrest had broken the rules and saved 16 lives. The mathematics of his victory were written not just in the one MiG confirmed destroyed that day, but in the 16 American airmen who returned home, in the hundreds who benefited from his tactical innovations in later engagements, and in the fundamental changes to fighter doctrine that endure to this day. It is a story of how institutions resist change even when that change is necessary, and of how sometimes the most valuable service a warrior can provide is to challenge the very system he has sworn to serve. What Captain Lawrence Forrest understood that April morning over the Gulf of Tonkin was something that military organizations often struggle to accept. That doctrine, no matter how carefully developed, is always an approximation, a best guess based on past experience. When reality diverges from doctrine, the true test of an officer's quality is not blind adherence to procedure, but the courage to adapt. There's a tendency in military organizations to mistake compliance for competence, Forrest once observed in a lecture to junior officers late in his career. But in combat, the enemy gets a vote, and when they cast that vote, all your carefully drawn plans may suddenly become obsolete. This observation highlights the paradox at the heart of Forrest's story. Military organizations require standardization and discipline to function effectively, yet rigid adherence to procedure can become a fatal weakness when confronted with adaptive enemies. The dilemma for any officer then becomes knowing when to follow orders and when to improvise, and having the moral courage to choose the latter when circumstances demand it. For the 8 Phantoms of VMFA 33 on April 18, 1972, that dilemma was resolved in a moment of crisis by an officer who had prepared for precisely such a contingency. Captain Forrest's decision to implement his unauthorized Mapline system represented not reckless disobedience, but calculated risk based on careful analysis and preparation. The key difference between recklessness and justified improvisation, Forrest later explained, is preparation. I didn't create the Mapline system in the moment. I'd spent months developing it, analyzing every scenario, calculating every probability. When the moment came, I wasn't guessing. I was implementing a plan I knew would work because I'd done the mathematics. This distinction between impulsive deviation from procedure and carefully considered alternative approaches forms the core of what military theorists now call disciplined initiative. It is the principle that allows subordinates to depart from established methods when those methods fail to address current realities, provided they remain focused on the commander's intent. The irony of Forrest's story is that his actions, while technically insubordinate, were entirely aligned with the fundamental mission of his squadron: to protect American aircraft and accomplish the assigned task. By prioritizing this mission over procedural compliance, he exemplified the highest form of military judgment. In the decades since that engagement over the Gulf of Tonkin, military doctrine has evolved to more explicitly encourage such initiative. Modern concepts like mission command and commander's intent formalize the principle that subordinates should have latitude to adapt when circumstances change, provided they remain focused on the desired outcome. Yet the institutional resistance that Forrest encountered, the reluctance to acknowledge innovative thinking from unexpected sources, the tendency to prioritize conformity over effectiveness, remains a challenge in military organizations worldwide. His story serves as both a cautionary tale about these tendencies and an inspiration for those who seek to overcome them. For the pilots and RIOs who flew with Forrest that day, the lesson was clear and immediate. As Captain Daniel Roberts later put it, "Larry taught us that sometimes survival depends on knowing which rules matter and which ones don't. The rule that says bring everyone home trumps the rule that says follow standard procedure every time." This perspective, that rules and procedures are means to an end, not ends in themselves, represents the essence of military professionalism. It acknowledges that judgment, not just obedience, is what separates the exceptional officer from the merely adequate. As we reflect on Captain Lawrence Forrest's Mapline call and its consequences, we are left with a profound question about the nature of courage in modern warfare. Is courage merely the willingness to face physical danger, or does it also encompass the moral fortitude to challenge established wisdom when lives are at stake? For the 16 American airmen who returned safely to Da Nang Air Base on April 18, 1972, the answer is clear. True courage includes both the bravery to face enemy fire and the integrity to act on conviction when conventional wisdom fails. In that moment over the Gulf of Tonkin, when 12 MiG fighters closed in on 8 American Phantoms, Captain Lawrence Forrest demonstrated both forms of courage. He faced the physical danger alongside his comrades, and he had the moral courage to implement a solution that violated procedure but saved lives. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? It's a question worth considering as we honor the memory of officers like Lawrence Forrest, whose contributions to military tactics often went unrecognized in their time, but whose legacy lives on in the doctrines and procedures that guide today's warriors. Share this story so others remember what courage really means, not just the courage to face danger, but the courage to think differently when lives depend on it.